I want to talk about Viktor Orban going on a mission of discovery. He went high, he went low, he went left ways, he went right ways. He looked all around, 360 degrees, and he could not find a peace plan anywhere. See, Viktor Orban has been one of the biggest advocates against military aid and continued support for Ukraine. His government has been staunchly opposed to continuing to send support, instead wanting to make a settlement probably on Russian terms for the longest time, continually advocating against sending weapons, referring to it as pouring fuel on the fire, and instead advocating to get rid of the sanctions on Russia, re-engage with the Russians, make a deal with them, probably give up some Ukrainian land, and then move on so they can then deepen their ties with the Russians further and benefit both from the economic ties of the European Union and cheap gas and investment from the Russian government. With the Russian government, I believe, also investing in the Hungarian energy sector as well. Okay, so that has been his position for the longest time. And we've usually talked about Viktor Orban when it comes to him opposing and stopping European Union support or NATO support, because Hungary is both an EU member and a NATO member, and therefore gets votes in affairs. And so it was usually only discussed when it was up to, you know, oh, we're going to pass this 10 billion, 20 billion, 30 billion package to Ukraine. Everybody says yes. Orban says no. How much do we have to give up to Orban in this, let's just say, aid hostage situation in order to actually get this stuff, which the vast majority of Europe believes is integral for their defense, through? And then they'd negotiate something, they talk, and they'd eventually, after finagling around, Orban would move 3, 4, 5, 6 years after when he should have. Usually by abstaining from the vote. So he doesn't even get behind it. He just doesn't show up to the decision on whether it's going or not going. I remember it was Olaf Scholz, I think, that proposed that in order to get around one of the hurdles of, you know, the EU accession talks for Ukraine. So generally opposed to integration into the European Union, opposed to integration into NATO, opposed to weapons aid, opposed to sanctions on the Russians. Generally speaking, just opposed to supporting Ukraine in their struggle against the Russians at every turn and every point. And being the one who was most saying it is time for the Ukrainians to negotiate with the Russians, thinking that talking can just solve the situation, and that as if, like, if we just talk to the Russians again and again and again, that's going to fundamentally change the position, with no change on the battlefield, no change in leadership, no change in the defense economics of the war. Despite the fact that he has seen no success with yelling this again and again and again, decided to go on a peace mission, or what he calls a peace mission. And so what he did is he first went to Ukraine, the first time he's made a state visit to Ukraine since the start of the war, and he talked to Zelensky about what would be needed for them in order to find peace with the Russians. And then he went to Moscow and had a meeting with Vladimir Putin and discussed similar things, as well as continued development between Russian and Hungarian relations. And after talking to the Ukrainians and after talking to the Russians, Viktor Orban came back with a message to shock the world. Orban says Kyiv and Moscow positions on peace are, and I quote, very far apart. Let's just let that shocking reality hang for a moment. Wow. Shocking. I know. I hope you guys braced before hearing that, and I'm sorry for those of you that I did not tell to sit down before dropping this bombshell revelation on the wider public. I hope when the big news agencies clip today's stream and share it around as further evidence of this shocking fact, that they include my utmost surprise at this announcement. Dude, I'm sorry. Like, all jokes aside, of course, the positions are very far apart. If anybody knows the history of the Istanbul talks before, during the start of the war, or the negotiations before the war, or any of the discussions since, the positions are extremely far apart. Even at the start, when the Ukrainians thought they were in the weakest position and they hadn't, held the Russians at bay for over 2 years, showing that they more than can fight the Russians. Even at that start of the war, the Russians were not just asking for the Ukrainians not to join NATO, and they were going to be taking land, and all of this as a preconditions for ceasefire. Another precondition for ceasefire, which wouldn't even be necessarily the end of the war, precondition for ceasefire in these Istanbul talks was Ukraine agreeing to a shrinking of their armed forces. That means going from a pre-war army of about 250,000, when the Russians have like over 1 million, so like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and the only real military threat Ukraine can have is from the army that just invaded them for the second time within an 8-year period, on top of all the times that they deployed military resources within the country illegally, or that they sent weapons or FSB agents, whoever, into the country to support the rebels, FSB agents, and Russian soldiers that were holding up the Donbass and Luhansk, and also Crimea. Not the rebels, but the official Russian army in Crimea. They wanted to shrink the army so significantly, and not only shrink it, but then limit the amount of artillery guns, limit the amount of armored vehicles Ukraine could have. That was Russia's ask. Not only that they don't join NATO, so they can't have a defensive alliance that would stop the Russians if they invaded again, but they also give up land, and on top of giving up the land, they would finally be restricted from having an armed force that can stop the Russians from invading. And so all of the buildup that they had done since 2014 would be completely disregarded, and they'd have to have an army that would be impossible to have any successful defense of Ukraine. They wanted to disarm the country that had just been invaded. Any nation state that is worried about its own survival would disregard that almost immediately. And they did, and they kept fighting, and the Russians pulled back from Kyiv, and the rest is history. But from the beginning, these positions have been very far apart, with the Russians interested in Ukraine's subjugation and Ukrainians interested in Ukraine's survival. Their interests at the very start are going to be completely distinct and different. The Ukrainians want the Russians to leave. The Russians just recently made an announcement that in order for them to talk about a ceasefire, not to have an agreement to have peace, but to talk about a ceasefire as a precondition, the Ukrainians have to pull out of Kherson and the city of Zaporizhia. Now, mind you, these are cities of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, on top of Kramatorsk, on top of Konstantinivka, on top of Chasiv Yar, which is being brutally fought for, street by street, room by room, on top of all these other locations. Limon, which was taken back during the counteroffensive, would I guess be given back again. All these locations would have Ukrainians who would either run away or then be killed, imprisoned, or tortured in occupied territory, in newly occupied territories, because it's always the first waves of repression that are some of the most awful. That's what they would need to agree. And roughly that territory, which the Russians are demanding, again, as a precondition to negotiate, is roughly the size of Taiwan, on top of what they currently occupy. These positions are totally different. But Orban had to do a photo op in Kyiv, and a photo op in Russia, and now, as of recent news, a photo op in Beijing in order to figure this out. Let's read what he had to say. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban said on July 5th that Ukraine and Russia's stances on the full-scale invasion and prospects for peace are, quote-unquote, very far apart. Over the past 2.5 years, we have realized that we cannot achieve peace without dialogue and diplomatic channels. I felt that the positions are very far from each other, that many steps need to be taken to establish peace, but the first important step towards dialogue has already been taken. Mind you, what he means is he talked to them. I don't know what he means outside of that, because it's not the Hungarians that decide when the war ends and when it doesn't. It's the Ukrainians, the Russians, and the ones that are backing them. Anyway, this is not surprising. The peace march that Orban did, insignificant, never going to have an impact. It didn't have an impact. And if anything, it just becomes virtue signaling. Almost like he can turn to his people and say, I tried. And recent conversations from Mark Rutte and Viktor Orban and from other European officials seem to indicate that Orban's going to be taking a back step when it comes to support for Ukraine. And the agreement generally seems to be, when it comes to NATO support for Ukraine and European support for Ukraine, is that Orban takes a back step, at least for when it comes to NATO. EU, I think it's more still divisive, takes a back step. He just lets it happen. The support goes to Ukraine, but he does not need to contribute to that support. And that's the deal. The deal is Viktor Orban doesn't block support as long as he doesn't have to contribute to support. That seems to be the deal moving forward. So if that's the deal moving forward, maybe this is a new way to add pressure, but all it ended up being was a failed peace mission. Moving on from that, though, because that's, I would say, the less interesting part. The more interesting part is the letter that Viktor Orban wrote to the EU chief that was then leaked to the press about his visit to Moscow and the takeaways he took, which had a lot of narratives in it that I think are at least of interest to people who are, trying to judge the Hungarians as good faith actors here. Dmitry Peskov out, Viktor Orban in. This is the opening line of the political piece. Mind you, Dmitry Peskov is Putin's press secretary. Spokesperson, sorry. In a leaked letter seen Tuesday by Politico, the Hungarian prime minister underlined Russian President Vladimir Putin's maximalist position on Ukraine so thoroughly he could have been auditioning for the role of Kremlin spokesperson. The massive address to the European Council President Charles Michel and others shared with other members of the European Council lays out Putin's thinking about the status of this war in Ukraine and what Orban reckons the EU's next step should be. It caps a week of manic diplomacy, during which Orban visited Kyiv, then Moscow, and then Beijing on a self-described Ukraine quote-unquote peace mission, days after Hungary assumed command of the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union. Orban told Michel that according to Putin, time is not on Ukraine's side, but on the side of the Russian forces, without providing any evidence or battlefield analysis. I assume they're talking about Russia obviously has more defense production than Ukraine, and Russia has more people than Ukraine. The idea being that Russia, the bigger country, with the bigger army, with the bigger economy, the longer it has time to build up its forces and clench its fist, the harder the hit Russia will put out is. That is like the analysis I generally speaking see about the war in Ukraine, but none of this has to be the case. Russia has lost wars before. They've lost war within the last 30 years. They have lost wars before that as well. Even countries that they had a bigger population with, bigger landmass with. Russia is not an invincible country. The quality of the armed forces could be less than the country than they're attacking. They could take an offensive position, which is going to take even more manpower than a defensive position. They have to stay and occupied and hold territory. And if the Ukrainians take a defensive position, that's going to be a problem as the Russians have to sustain it through time. The Russians are taking astronomically higher loss rates than the Ukrainians, both in manpower and when it comes to armored reserves, tanks, APCs, and even if they don't run out of these things, the quality of these things will continue to deteriorate, which would then have a downstream effect on the soldiers who have to drive these things. And one thing is, you can keep replacing T-64s for years into the future. Tank crews are not so easily replaceable. You can always put anyone in a tank, but not anyone of quality. And the less quality you have, the more frequently you're going to lose your tank drivers, which then spirals. And then the situation gets worse and worse and worse and worse as the quality continues to go down and down and down and down and down, etc. Point is, Viktor Orban hearing from Putin that we want everything, and the longer this goes on, the better it will be for us, is Putin basically leaning towards the longer it takes for us to clench our fist, the more resources we bring to bear. But again, this assumes that the armed forces will be of high enough quality to do this, that they have enough equipment to sustain this, that they could, if they wanted to, without enough political pushback to stop them, go through another wave of mobilization to gather those resources by force, because they're getting 25 to 30,000 volunteers a month, if you believe Russian figures, which Western intelligence agency seems to at least somewhat believe. But that's just enough to sustain the current war effort. So if the Ukrainians get more shells or start making the Russians bleed more and they start engaging in wider offensive operations, I mean, it's a hard enough challenge to sustain the current war effort, let alone expand it and gather more troops to push on. And if they were to do that by force, that would be, I mean, unpopular. The one time that Putin's support dropped during this war was during the first wave of mobilization. A second wave of mobilization would not be viewed popularly. Anyway, continuing. Just saying that, like, saying that without any battlefield analysis, like, it's kind of like, I don't know. It just shows the Russian position, nothing else. Orban, who denied he was articulating any opinion on behalf of the European Council or European Union during his Moscow visit, went on to say that the Russian side estimates that the monthly losses and casualty of the Ukrainian forces are at 40 to 50,000 soldiers, while making no reference to Russian losses in the war. Okay, so number one, this is not true. This is not true. There is nothing that I've seen that bears that out. The Russians, at the start of the war, the Russians claimed that they destroyed more aircraft than Ukraine has. They have claimed loss ratios that are quite literally physically impossible. For this, what they're talking about for monthly loss ratios, I don't see any serious person who's engaged in OSCENT, like research to find losses or any, like, there's been nothing that I've seen that is reporting these high losses, especially as Ukraine takes the largely defensive position. And so for him to just repeat that word for word, while also not talking about Russian losses and just like, I mean, that is just regurgitating the Russian position. That is all that is doing. He added that Moscow was ready to consider any ceasefire proposal that does not serve the hidden relocation and reorganization of Ukrainian forces, without explaining further what Putin meant by that. Does that mean that, again, that they still are demanding, as Putin has suggested before, the Istanbul format, which would include, if they're going by the original Istanbul format, the demilitarization of Ukraine, which is what Putin said at the start of this war, which is one of his goals. And if he is still trying to achieve that, then are we just saying that Ukraine should disarm itself after being invaded by this country twice within a 8-year period? And we're saying that with like a straight look on our face. In Orban's account of the meeting, he says he observed to Putin that many argue that it is in the interest of Europe to return to a period of economic growth based on lasting peace as soon as possible. The chance for peace is diminished by the fact that diplomatic channels are blocked and there is no direct dialogue between the parties who have a leading role to play in creating the conditions for peace. The EU and its leaders have largely shut down communications with Moscow amid a deluge of sanctions leveled by the bloc against Russia following the invasion. On Wednesday, the EU ambassadors in Brussels will discuss Orban's trips. If that debrief tomorrow goes in the same tone as this letter, it will be a pleasant meeting, a sarcastic EU diplomat who is granted anonymity to discuss the sensitive subject told Politico. Nothing, but nothing of all the European Council efforts over the past 2.5 years is reflected in this. Orban wrote in point 8 that he believed a ceasefire and peace talks were still possible, but added that in the next 2 months we will see more dramatic losses and military developments on the front line than ever before if the war doesn't come to a halt. He then concluded that Europe should take the lead on trying to thrash out peace in Ukraine, given that the US is increasingly distracted as its November presidential election approaches. By the way, Orban has been openly backing Trump to be president. Orban has been going to the United States, speaking at CPAC, talking to the Conservative Political Action Conference, and they have welcomed this horribly corrupt. Orban leads the most corrupt country in the EU when it comes to public sector corruption, to a point where it's an open joke, and they're bringing this guy in to help represent the swamp cleaners, okay? Just throwing that out there. Political leadership provided by the United States is limited due to the ongoing election. Therefore, we can expect no such proposals coming from the US in the coming months. We should consider, in the spirit of European strategic autonomy, launching a European initiative. Oh, like Ukraine's peace initiative. Oh, he's not a big fan of that. Orban's mission, at least in terms of ending the war, is unlikely to succeed. On Monday, after Russian forces bombed a children's hospital in Kyiv, by the way, his response to the bombing of the children's hospital was just like, oh my God, how sad. No matter who did it, it is a tragedy. And it just shows why the war needs to end. It was as milquetoast of a critique to actually, it was not a critique of the person who did it or the people who did it whatsoever. It was just a vague call for tranquility. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky trashed his attempt at interlocution with the Kremlin. That won't likely deter the Hungarian leader, however. Orban signed off the note, "I will continue my talks aimed at clarifying the opportunities for peace next week." So you're going to expect more movements from this as Orban tries to use his new position of prominence within the European Council in order to try to promote this view. But the European Union has been working against the policies of Orban for, as this article says from the anonymous EU official, for the better part in 2.5 years. Expect most of this to just be noise. Putin has not moved. Zelensky has not moved. Orban has openly admitted that they have not moved and their positions are far apart. His repeating of Russian talking points and made up lost statistics change nothing. It's not going to be convincing to French leaders. It's not going to be convincing to German leaders. And it coming from the mouth of Orban, somebody who's been saying this type of stuff since the start anyway, it certainly isn't going to surprise anyone. If this came out of the mouth of someone like, I don't know, Olaf Scholz or Macron, maybe it'd be more surprising, but people expected this from him. And so he shouldn't be surprised by the results that he found in Moscow and Kyiv. And I also don't think he should be surprised if the rest of Europe largely just kind of ignores him until his term at the top of the council expires. C'est quoi? I forget how to say it.